Good morning, everyone, and welcome. We're so glad that you are joining us today. This is the last of our 5 COVID series webinars on managing finances today. We're going to get started in just a moment. We're just going to let a little bit more time pass for people to join and not miss out. So just stick with us a moment. Welcome, those of you who are just now joining us. We're going to get started in just a moment. We're just going to let a little bit more time pass, let others join, get settled. We're very excited to have you with us. All right. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to When Finances Feel Out of Control, hosted by the Boone Center for the Family with Pepperdine University. We're so glad that you chose to spend your morning with us. Today is the last webinar in our 5-part coronavirus pandemic series. And we have a very special guest today. We have Dr. Terry Hargrave with us today. He is the founder of Restoration Therapy and the Evelyn and Frank Freed Professor of Marriage and Family Therapy at Fuller Theological Seminary with us today. He has many resources available on our Boone Center for the Family site, actually. And I'm just gonna transition over to let you know as we get started, to keep in the back of your mind that you can always go to the booncenter.pepperdine.edu/resources, where you can find all the past webinars that you may have missed on the pain and the peace cycle, on anxiety, on loneliness, on shaken identity. You can find some tips and advice in videos, blogs, and also free quick reference guides for you to use in this time. So if you are feeling like you needed a little bit more information on something, feel free to go there. We'll also be putting in the link later. And besides that, we are ready for Terry to take it away. Welcome.
Thank you so much, April. It's my privilege to be with you today, and I'm excited to share some information with you about finances, particularly when finances feel out of control. You know, I certainly understand that our main fear that's centered in the pandemic centers around the idea of health and safety, and there may be governmental and policy concerns, but there's no denying that one of the phenomenal impacts of COVID-19 has been the impact on our world economy. Not only has it sent us spinning into a recession, but it certainly has the potential of having some long-term effects where we're not only in a long-term recession, but even perhaps a depression. And that's had immediate effects on us. Just since February, the Kaiser Foundation has been tracking some of these items, and they've found out some interesting facts about how COVID-19 is affecting us and our economic stability. Right now, we know that over half the workforce say that they've either lost a job, they've been furloughed, they've had to take a pay cut. In other words, the impact of COVID-19 is definitely affecting the economy. 4 out of 10 adults say either they or their spouse or partner have experienced a job loss or a cut in salary. That tells you the widespread economic impact. Unemployment and now in the United States, that tracks about 3 weeks behind actual jobless claims, is right at about 16 to 17%. That is a phenomenal increase from where we were just a few months ago when we were under 4%. This is a really impactful framework of when we're thinking about the economic impact and when finances are a real problem, is that overall 3 out of 10 adults, 30%, say that they've fallen behind in paying bills, affording household expenses, just things like food or health insurance. These things are a tremendous challenge. But if you think that that's an overall bad picture, think about a younger generation, the 18 to 29-year-old group. That's about 4 out of 10. So about 4 out of 40% of that younger group. So it's disproportionately affecting them as they're experiencing the economic fallout of the pandemic. And over about half the adults, 56%, are identifying that worry or stress related things that are related to the outbreak are causing them to experience a lot of negative effect on their mental health, like they're having sleeping and eating problems, they're increasing alcohol use or worsening chronic conditions. We know that stress, just simple stress, is one of the main health crises in the United States and in fact the world. And so you combine this pandemic with that kind of framework, and certainly people are staying awake at night wondering, how am I going to pay my bills? How am I going to keep a roof over my head? What is the long-term economic outlook for me? And many people are worried about their entire careers or industries that are going on. There are many, many ways that we can talk about how to deal with finances. And what I want you to know is I am a big supporter of the kind of budgeting help, the kind of debt ideas of how to help yourself and help your family. People like Dave Ramsey, Larry Burkett, Mary Hunt, Robert Katz, these folks put together wonderful budgeting programs to help you think and saying, how do I reduce my debt load? How do I gain control of my finances in a constructive way? How do I proceed in terms of managing the amount of resource that I have? Those are excellent programs, and I want you to know I fully support those things. But here's the reality that I want to spend my time in talking about today. There's a precursor that is in your personhood, your personality, if you will, that if you don't pay attention to that kind of thinking or that kind of reasoning in your personhood, then all the budgeting help in the world will not take care of your financial stress or your financial management issues. Budgeting type programs will, unless you take care of the basic foundational issue in your heart, they will just simply make you more educated at what you refuse to do. And I think you probably have experienced some of those issues of if you've had trouble practicing the idea of budgeting. Many, many times that's locked into our personhood of the way that we are. You see, on your screen, you have this line, and what I want you to think of is that that vertical line is being a continuum from one end to the other to put a gradient. All of us as human beings function on the idea, we have it inbred to our brain from one generation to the next, the way we were made to think in terms of fight or flight. When we feel stressed, we either really move to this fight mechanisms of saying, we're going to take charge of this situation, we're going to exert our power, we're going to control the situation. And of course, this is particularly true with financial stress. When we're thinking about whether or not we have enough money, some of us are buckling down and really thinking about how I manage every dime and penny that I get my hands on. What are my long-term future outlooks in terms of my career? How do I get the education that I need? And so on and so forth. Those kinds of things are a way of reacting to the stress that we're currently under with our finances that really fit more into the way our brain mechanism functions. The other side of the extreme is anxiety and escape. When we feel stress, we also have this potential to say, whoa, that's too much for me. I cannot take that kind of stress in the everyday framework of thinking about my finances. So many times I just become so overwhelmed with the anxiety that I want to somehow escape the anxiety, get out of it. So I don't manage it. I more or less try not to think about it. It's not that one is healthy and one is not healthy. Actually, at the extreme, power and control is just as dysfunctional, because you then start denying people their basic needs, or even maybe even denying yourself the ability to spend any of your money, because you're so over controlling and fearful that you have to have the management of every dime. On the other hand, anxiety and escape are very unhealthy, because they tend to make us want to not pay attention to any details, and therefore we don't plan at all. What we're of course looking at, if you look at your cursor, is we're looking for you to be more in the middle, in this balanced idea where you have some control, you recognize the fears that you have, but indeed you're not at the extremes where you're over controlling or you're trying to escape. Now, I think that that's one helpful way of thinking about it, but let's add another continuum on this framework. And this is mainly in Western societies, but it's a more helpful way of thinking about it also, is that part of us, the way that we look at money is that we're overindulgent. Part of this philosophy would be like, oh, well, if I have it, I should spend it. Money's not important. We may even Christianize it in some ways, saying, that Jesus teaches us that we can't be committed to God and committed to money at the same time. And so therefore, money is to use for good purposes. And that doesn't mean that I spend all the money on myself. I may spend the money on other people, but the framework is that I'm extraordinarily overindulgent. I don't think about meeting my needs in a reasonable way. I overindulge spending. At the other end of the extreme is underindulgent, where I get so stingy and tight that I really, I squeeze my pennies so hard I turn them into copper wire. I mean, it's just a daily framework of saying, I do not let go of any of my money. Of course, in this continuum, overindulgence is just as damaging to people as underindulgence. Stinginess, for instance, is just as bad as being too exorbitant with your money. What we're looking for, of course, is people in the middle that are willing to let go of their money, but at the same time frugal enough to be able to make things work. I hope that makes sense to you. Now, if we put those two continuums together, you start seeing the patterns. So remember, the end of that vertical continuum is power and control, and the other end is anxiety and escape. You have people that are underindulgent with money and overindulgent with money. That creates these four quadrants that tell us a little bit about how people spend money. For instance, if you were a person that was really into power and control, you use you handle your anxiety around money by trying to control it, and you happen to be overindulgent, well, that might lead you to use what we call, and by the way, these designations come from a man named David Olson and the research of his uses for money. You might use money for status. Now, we normally think of status as like keeping up with the Joneses. It can include that. You will find people who keep up with the Joneses in this utilizing money for status, but it also indicates that people might look at their money as ways to pathways to achievement. In other words, they want to use their money for purposes that that move them in a progression. So it's not just a greediness to make sure that people notice who I am. It may be even for good ideas of saying, I want to accomplish positive influences in the uses of my money. On the other hand, if we were looking at this kind of quadrant where people are very controlling with money and underindulgent, then you would find that those kind of folks could be classified as that they use money for control. This kind of control means that I exert my power in my family by making sure that the only money that is spent is the money that I agree to spend. You don't have the privilege to decide how we use money. I use money the way that I want it to be used. This might, at the extremes, it might really lead to somebody being over controlling. Now, keep in mind that these unhealthy patterns would be at the extreme, like keeping up with the Joneses would be overindulgent and in the extreme of power and control. But if you were using money mainly for achievement purposes, or you wanted to see good purposes, you might be more in the mid-range of this framework where you weren't totally overindulgent, but you were indeed spending money in order to accomplish things. People that are over-controlling, we can imagine the stinginess that could come from the extremes of power and control and underindulgence, but there are also mid-range people that use money because they want to get a hold of their finances and they want to be reasonable about things. And therefore they keep budgets. In terms of underindulgence and anxiety and escape, a lot of these people use money for security. At the extreme, you would see people that are security-based as saying, I want to hold on to every dime because I'm scared I'm going to need it. These type of folks they'll save and save and save. And so therefore they want to make sure that they have money in an emergency. So even now during a time of pandemic crisis, they would be saving money, somehow denying themselves in order to make sure that there's enough money for the future, even going without things like food or electricity. That kind of anxiety at the extreme can be extraordinarily unhealthy, and it's an insatiable need. For instance, no matter what I do, I don't spend the money that I need. So if I have $10,000 in the bank, I'll only feel comfortable when I have 20,000. And when I get 20,000, I want 50,000. And finally, the overindulgent people that are run by anxiety and escape, they might have the temptation to slip into this pattern of enjoyment. I only use money to escape. So anytime I feel financial stress, I want to spend money to make me feel good, to get me on that vacation, or to even get me in a moment where I can feel better about the situation on buying clothes or frivolous things that I don't really need, but they make me feel good in the moment. Well, you can see that any one of these four frameworks can be used in a healthy way if they're more balanced in the framework. But once you start reaching the extremes, this is when that personality of your money style can be very unhealthy. So the framework would be saying, so what do we do when finances are a problem? Well, I have a few tips for you I want you to consider. First of all, you have to be realistic. The pandemic and economic fallout is real. We have to, and it's going to be with us for a while. All the indications are is that the economic turmoil from this thing are going to be with us for 12 to 18 months. So being realistic is saying there's no way I can short term hold on to every cent of my money. At the same time, I just can't keep spending and spending and spending. I have to be realistic that I have to utilize this time to be more balanced in my thinking about money. The other thing is to really watch out for your weakness. If you know you're out of balance on one of these four uses of money, be on your guard. For instance, I am by nature, I like to use money for enjoyment. I don't spend a lot of money on myself because I get joy out of spending my money on others, but usually that's escape oriented. Now, when it's beneficial and I'm in a balanced way, I'm not spending every dime of my money, but I have to admit, I have bought a few games to divert my family and lift the mood a little bit. And I found all sorts of new games like Throw Burrito to divert the attention of my family, or purchasing an outdoor portable fire pit so that we could roast marshmallows. Well, these are little interventions where I use my money for the purpose of just these momentary escapes. I've got to be really attentive because I could get into the habit of ordering something every day and really get myself in financial trouble if I went to that extreme. You may have a tendency, just like I have, that could get you into an extreme as the stress of the pandemic puts more and more pressure on you. The third thing that I want you to know is that when finances become a problem is be hopeful. Remember that this time of economic stress will eventually pass. And so relationships, families, your spiritual growth, those are the things that are the most important elements in our learning. And then my suggestion is that when stress is high is the best time to change. It's not the best time to move back to your anxiety or your power or control or your overindulgence or underindulgence and say, well, I'll do better once this time is over. Actually, this time of stress is the exact time that you want to practice the good habits of getting out of your overindulgence or your underindulgent stinginess. It's also a good time to think in terms of saying, I'm not going to be governed by my need to control the situation because there are things that are out of my control. I'm not going to be governed by my need for escape or my anxiety. I'm going to start moving myself toward the middle. Work toward the middle of the graph is the best kind of framework. Anytime we take on growth, it really speaks to the idea that we have to have courage. We have to have endurance to be able to do those things. I love this quote by Maya Angelou. Courage is the most important of all the virtues because without courage, you cannot practice any other virtue consistently. You can practice any virtue erratically, but nothing consistently without courage. In other words, you have to be courageous to say, even though I feel the tendency to be overwhelmed by anxiety or power or my need for overindulgent spending or underindulgent spending, I want to be sure I want to grow. I'm going to take the courageous step to change. In scriptural terms, we see that as a process. Not only that, but we rejoice in sufferings, knowing that sufferings, and believe me, coronavirus is definitely a suffering. Suffering produces endurance. That's that part where courage comes in. And endurance produces character. And character produces hope. And hope does not disappoint. This time will pass. It is a hopeful situation. I would say we need to deal with our financial stress as a stressor that will help us grow during this time and not put us further behind what we normally do with our finances. So I want to offer that as encouragement, but I also want to make some time for some questions. So what questions do you have for me? April?
Wow, Terry, thank you so much for that insightful presentation. We do have a few questions that have come in for you today. The first one was that you had mentioned a list of some programs for managing finances, such as Dave Ramsey, Larry Burkett. What were the other ones?
Mary Hunt has written a book on getting out of financial debt, and Robert Katz has written a book that's quite helpful in terms of biblical principles in handling money.
Great, thank you. We had a couple questions, just missing those last two names. We have another question that has come in. Do you have any advice, or is there a certain resource that people might be able to access to help identify, as you mentioned, some of our money styles in relationship to just what we're prone to with our personalities?
Yes, I think that this is more research-based, but nonetheless very, very helpful. If you track down David Olson and Andy Dufresne, Defrain, they've written a lot on this issue of utilizing finances in a balanced way and those four styles. And that's what I've combined with this circumplex model of anxiety and power and overindulgence and underindulgence to kind of enlighten you a little bit more about it. But Olson and Dufresne, their work is very helpful.
Great. We have another question. Is there another graph that covers just blame and shame? And are these coping mechanisms related to finance specifically?
Absolutely. You know, for those of you that know and understand the pain cycle, you can probably see some parallels of how this fight and flight start focusing in on that, and how we can get into unhealthy coping reactivity from our pain cycle by trying to prove ourselves. For instance, that leads us to think, well, maybe I'll use my money as status, or that I have to over control something that may end me up in the control quadrant, or even this shaming of self, which might be a more tendency toward security, or escape, which might be more of a tendency toward enjoyment. So there's definite parallels that are going on there. Yeah, I'll probably write about that.
That's great. Yes. And as a reminder, if you haven't already submitted a question, but you're kind of hanging on to something, feel free to put it into the Q&A box. You can send it anonymously. And if we don't get to it in the next few minutes, we're happy to email back any responses, and even Dr. Terry Hargrave's willing to share a little bit more about that. We have another question. This one's really great. So you spent a lot of time about how the individual who's watching this can figure out ways to understand where their financial stress is coming from and some of the ways that they might be able to cope with that. How can we walk alongside some of our loved ones and help them figure out the root cause of what's causing them financial stress, particularly when they aren't asking for help, but we can see that they're clearly distraught?
That's a great question, and I think that the best help to a loved one is good modeling. In other words, when we change ourselves and we're vulnerable enough to share what we're learning about ourselves. For instance, I just shared with you my tendency to use money as enjoyment. When I start explaining those facts just in the framework, and by the way, this PDF of these slides will be available to you on the Boone Center website, that will enable you to walk through and identify what your weaknesses are and what your styles are and what your tendencies are. I've had to take myself back and say, I have that tendency to use money for enjoyment, and it could get me in trouble. And I've probably made some purchases that I would have been better off putting that money away. It forces me back to balance because I'm more vulnerable. as my loved ones hear me be vulnerable, then that leads them to start not being threatened in identifying themselves within that tendency and trying to identify how can I also grow, because I see Terry growing. It's not so threatening to lead my family members into their kind of growing, but I do it by modeling, not by preaching.
Wow, that's really great. It can be so hard when we see someone that we really care about going through something like that and trying to do it alone. So I love your advice on modeling and how we can experience that freedom of not only helping ourselves, but as we're doing that, we can be influencing the people we really care about. Well, we're just about out of time, so I want to thank everyone for coming. And I think we have a slide up that might just have a couple things we can point you to wrap up. As a reminder, if you didn't get your question answered, feel free to email us at centerforthefamily, that's FOR, not the number 4, .pepperdine.edu, and we're happy to get back to you on some of your questions. And any of the resources, especially for those of you who are interested on the graphs on blame and shame, we encourage you to check out some of our resources on the Boone Center website that cover the pain and peace cycle, and even our past webinar where Dr. Terry Hargrave shared a little bit more on some of those issues. So we'd just like to thank you so much for your time today and for tuning in. We've really enjoyed these last webinars with you, and we wish you all the best as you're navigating through this unprecedented time.